Welcome to the Nourish Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
If you have a child who carries a few extra pounds or more than a few, and you worry about his eating and health, this is the show for you. Today, I'm talking about the mental health aspects of child weight, including weight stigma, mental health, and self-esteem. Welcome back to the Nourish Child. I'm Jill Castle, your host. With me today is Dr. Lori Fishman. She's a child psychologist, parenting expert, and founder of Past, Parent, and Future, an online training program for parents who want to help their children manage weight without shame. She's formerly served as an attending psychologist at Boston Children's Hospital and instructor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Her recent book, 3+3 Stars for Me, is a self-esteem and confidence-boosting journal for children. Welcome to the show, Dr. Fishman.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today.
I'm very excited to have this conversation with you. I have been following your work and particularly on Instagram. And as I mentioned to you before we started recording this, I feel like we have a sister soulship here around the topic of child weight. And but before we dive into that topic, I'd love for you to share with the audience how you got into child psychology and the work you do today as a child psychologist with overweight children.
Sure. Yeah. So I actually struggled with my own weight history as a young person. And a big part of my story is about being overweight in the 80s and early 90s and what that was like as a child, because the diet culture back then was very different than it is now. And I think my parents really struggled with how to help me. So I was on everything from Richard Simmons, Weight Watchers, like Jane Fonda workout videos. I mean, all these old Slim Fast shakes, and growing up, I learned how to diet, but I never learned how to have a healthy relationship with food and exercise. I just had learned how to try different diets. So I have that background. And then going into psychology, I ended up doing health psychology. And I originally started in working with children in a pediatric oncology program, which was really rewarding, but also pretty sad. And then when I had my own daughter, I found it really hard to work in that kind of healthcare setting where we were losing children. So I changed my focus to health promotion. Mm-hmm. And in that, I ended up working in the obesity clinic at Boston Children's Hospital. And I was doing that for about 12 years up until very recently during the pandemic, when I decided I wanted to be able to offer my expertise to a larger audience than just who could come to Boston or who wanted to be seen at a hospital. And so now I'm trying to spread awareness online through Instagram and online programs and books and all of those avenues.
Yeah. So I suspect we had some crossover perhaps at Boston Children's Hospital, but if we didn't, I did interview the dietitian and maybe the social worker who was affiliated with the OWL program at Children's Hospital.
That's the program I was in.
Yeah. And we talked about sort of those children with very high weight and some of the work that was being done in that program. But today, I actually really want to hone in on the psychological aspects of carrying extra body weight, whether it's a few extra pounds pre-puberty or if it's significant extra weight in children and what that psychological impact is. So can you cover give us an overarching sort of bird's eye view of what the mental health risks are for children who are, overweight?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly self-esteem and body image issues are abundant at this age group anyway, regardless of size, based on all sorts of factors. But particularly for kids who are overweight, there tends to be more bullying. Sometimes they really struggle with keeping up athletically, and that can be hard if they want to participate on a team but feel like they're slower than their peers, or they might have asthma or other health-related issues related to their weight that make it harder for them to keep up. Mm-hmm. Other kids I see who have a few extra pounds, like you said, might be extremely athletic. So that really varies. And I see a lot of kids who don't get bullied at all, but who do also feel quite bad about themselves. I think the bigger issue is less about the weight and more about how the eating and exercise habits themselves impact mood and learning and behavior, right? So if your child's eating a lot of sugar, if your child isn't really moving or getting a lot of exercise, they're more likely to be moody, anxious, depressed, or have learning issues or have behavioral difficulties because they're not getting that energizing nutrition.
Mm-hmm. And energizing activity, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So can you speak to sort of the connection between, you mentioned that you were raised in a dieting environment. I feel like parents are getting the message today around, the fact that dieting, weight loss diets are not the path to true long lasting health. But there's also sort of this component of disordered eating, and you also mentioned relationship with food. Can you talk to those 2 points a little bit more as it pertains to how a child views themselves, views food, functions in the world?
Right. So I feel like there's this sense among parents that maybe they shouldn't mention it at all. So often what I experience is a parent calls me and says, my child's really overweight, but I don't want to say anything to them because when I was growing up, my parents were really mean about it and really shamed me. And I don't want to do that to my child. Like probably hear that 15 times a week, that same story, which I can relate to because I experienced it. So what they've done is throw their hands up entirely and just kind of watch these behaviors happen, maybe some sneaking, maybe some overeating, maybe some, true inactivity. And they're afraid to comment because they don't want their child to think that they're shaming them or calling them fat, and they're afraid that they're going to cause an eating disorder.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is that parents can't ignore this because it's probably most likely not going to go away on its own.
Mm-hmm.
And parents do need to role model and provide a healthy environment for their child. But there is a way that parents can address it without it being shaming. Right. So there's a difference between helping your child make healthy decisions and what kind of food environment you're creating in your home versus telling a child they're fat or they're lazy or they can't have this because they're too heavy or their sibling can have this cookie, but you can't. There's all of those shaming ways of interacting around food, but then there's lots of ways that aren't like that. So you don't have to be a bad cop around food, but you can't really ignore it entirely.
So I get these statements too from parents all the time. I had a private practice in Nashville, and 53% of my clientele, I actually did a study on my practice to see like what types of patients I was seeing. And it was 53% were children who were overweight or diagnosed with, obesity. And this was back in the, 2008 to 2012. And even back then, parents were so afraid of damaging their children. And it was I always felt like it was this fine dance about what can you say and what can't you say. And I really felt like you don't really have to say anything. It's really about just setting up an environment that encourages healthy behaviors. What kind of advice do you give your patients and your parents of your patients around, what they can say, what they can do that is not going to cause shame?
Right. So number one, and you'll relate to this, role modeling, right? So, both by engaging in the healthy behaviors yourself, making a whole family change, right? So we're not going to highlight one child in a family. And I don't know why so often, Jill, I'll get a family where there's a heavier child who's struggling. And then there's this teeny tiny child who can't gain weight and can eat whatever they want.
Yes.
Like according to the parents, right? Like, well, I don't have to worry about my younger son because he gets away with it. I always hear that. He gets away with it, right? What does that actually mean? It just means he doesn't put on weight from eating junk food. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's good for him or that it's benefiting him in terms of school or behavior.
Right. Right.
So I feel like it's really important to make a whole family change. So that's something parents can do, role modeling and having everyone in the family have similar rules, right? Have similar food. I think the other piece is being really careful about how many triggers and types of foods you're having in the home all of the time. I always go back to the reference of the candy bowl on the table. I grew up with a candy bowl on the table, and then I would get yelled at for eating the candy. And it's like, well, why do you put it out if we're not supposed to eat it?
Yes.
And I feel like that's just the best reference. I feel like there are two types of personality styles in the world. There's the people who can walk by that candy bowl every day and ignore it. And then there's the people who it just screams at them, right? And it's like, eat me, take me. And I think a lot of the kids that we see that struggle with weight have a really hard time faced with that temptation.
Sure.
And so while I don't, want parents to restrict any one food entirely and say, like, you can never have candy, I'd prefer that it wasn't in these child's faces all day while they're at home in a place that's supposed to be safe and easy for them to not have to make these decisions.
Yeah.
And they'll get it. They get it at school. They get it at friends' houses. They get it at parties. There's plenty of opportunities to eat junk. And I'm not saying don't let your child have those things if they're at a party or if they're with their friends. I'm just saying they're going to end up having them twice, like at your house and then next door.
Yes.
Their friend's house, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I always say too, have a plan for sweets and treats, like actually have a strategy in your mind, how often and when. And so as a parent, you're putting that structure behind those foods. You don't have to say anything to your child, but you've got some sort of plan in your mind for how frequently, when, where, how much, how often. But I want to just circle back on the whole comment about, or the topic of, a family having a heavy child and a thin child. I got that. I've seen a lot of that too. And I think what is important for our listeners to understand is that we have so much information now, particularly around research around sort of the genetic heritability of obesity, as you probably well know, that you can have a whole family where some children in the family are going to have the more of a genetic predisposition to gain weight from eating even healthy foods. They're just genetically going to be more inclined for that. And you can have a child in your family that is not got that gene makeup, right? And so that helps to explain to parents why you can see such a discrepancy in your own children within one family. And I think what you said is so important for parents to hear, which is just because you have a child who shows up in a thin body and a child who shows up in a fat body, all the rules apply. Like you're raising a whole family to be healthy, right? And you're not serving that thin child well if you're letting them have whatever, whenever, because later on in life, that's not going to serve them well anyways from a health standpoint, right?
Right. Yes. And, think about it, and you probably experience this in children's as well. So if your child is underweight, they could be seen in the growth and nutrition program, right? And in that program, a lot of the nutrition recommendations are actually the same as the recommendations we're making in the obesity program. We're not saying fill your tiny child up with more sugar to help them gain weight. We're saying fats and protein constantly. And that's what we're telling the overweight children as well. More fat, more protein, so you stay full and satisfied, and you don't need to sneak candy later because you're not starving.
Right.
So it ends up being the same advice. I just think is hilarious, because I think there's this message like, my kid will only eat candy bars, and they need to gain weight, so I'm just going to keep doing that. And then they wonder why they're not gaining weight, right?
Yeah.
So both spectrums are pretty much the same.
Yes. And to tag on to that, excuse me, I have a little frog in my throat. To tag on to that is this whole idea of prevention and treatment. They're not very different either.
Right.
What you do in treatment is really a lot of what you're doing in prevention,
Absolutely.
Structure in the home and balance and Yeah.
And I think a lot of parents are looking for a cause. Right? They want to know, like, is this a genetic thing? Do they have an underlying endocrine issue? Like, what is causing my child to be overweight? Like, they eat healthy, they exercise. I don't get it. And the reality is, aside from a few tiny discrepancies here and there, the intervention for whatever the diagnosis is going to be the same no matter what, right? So whether it's diabetes, whether it's another underlying endocrine issue, it's usually never solved just with medication. You're going to have to do these exercise and dietary changes anyway.
Right.
So knowing the cause, while it might be helpful, it's not going to change the course of action.
Right. Exactly. You talked about anti-diet, that you are anti-diet, not, there's these terms floating around: anti-diet, non-diet. I prefer the term pro-lifestyle myself, because I feel like diet is way too narrow of a topic when it comes to these kids. It's really a pro-lifestyle approach, which does include diet, obviously. But when I look at this condition, this medical condition for a lot of children, that is just a tiny little slice of the pie. There's like so much other stuff that parents can focus on and work on, and just narrowly focusing on food and eating, I think, is potentially very shaming, because as we were kind of chit-chatting before I hit the record button, kids have to eat. We all have to eat to live. And so when you build so much shame and stigma in the process of eating, in the food choices that kids have, that in and of itself is potentially damaging. And so I'm interested in your thoughts about our hyper focus on food as a culture, and sort of how you process that and think about that when you're working with your population.
Sure. So I love pro-lifestyle. I look at it as family wellness. So I think we all have our terms, right?
Sure.
And I like wellness because it's not just about food. And quite honestly, a lot of the issues that come along with overweight or obesity for children and adults aren't related just to food. They're related to sleep, right? And they're related to mood. So for example, a child with anxiety or ADHD might have different issues related to food that a child that doesn't struggle with those issues doesn't experience. So you're looking at more of a wellness factor, like how is the child doing emotionally? How is the child doing with sleep? Like, are they being active at all? Are they on screens for 10 hours a day? None of these things have anything to do with food.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so when you mentioned before about parents talking about, how parents can talk to their kids about this without shaming, I make the whole focus on wellness, right? Like, it's not good for any of us to not move our bodies.
Right.
It has nothing to do with weight. You could be the most, fit person in the world which means you probably are moving your body. But if you're not, like, that doesn't make you healthier.
Mm-hmm.
Like, a very thin person isn't healthier than a very obese person if neither of them are exercising, right? So I think that's the thing. It's moving, it's eating nutritious foods that give you energy, that make you able to learn and pay attention in school, that make you feel not hangry, not moody, right? Not having these low blood sugar drops where you're aggressive or upset, right? There's all these aspects that have nothing to do with weight. You could have like I said, a tiny child that gets hangry, or a tiny child that doesn't move. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're healthier than your more overweight child. Right,
right. When we think about stigma and bias around weight, I know a lot of parents out there might be sort of thinking, what is stigma? I mean, what is weight stigma? I'm not 100% clear on what they mean when they talk about that. Can you help parents understand what we're talking about when we say weight stigma, weight bias? Give us sort of that parent speak explanation for those terms, if you would.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I hear is, there's this bias about when you see a child who's overweight. I think there's this way that people tend to just assume that the parents are feeding that child garbage.
Yeah.
Right. And I hear all the time parents will come in and say, I truly try. I try to get them to go outside. I buy fruits and vegetables. Like, I don't understand. My kid's not eating McDonald's all day long. Right. Yeah. And I think there's this idea that, like, if you see a really heavy child at the park, for example, you're like, there's this bias of like, oh, what are the parents feeding that kid, or what, but if you see a really tiny child, there's very little bias, honestly, actually. Yeah. It's more just like, oh, poor thing, he can't get bigger. Right. Yeah. It's more sympathy. Right. And so I feel like there's that weight stigma. But there's also in school, I think kids are teased a lot for, again, the athletic piece. I think this happens in other directions as well at school. Kids will tease each other about anything.
Yeah.
But the weight stigma goes back to the parents being responsible. And I think that's why parents have a hard time addressing it, because I think parents do feel ashamed of themselves and do feel responsible and do feel like they should have done something differently. And they're afraid to get help or approach it because they feel like it was their fault in the first place.
Yeah. And I think our society puts blame on parents. And, ironically, have you read, this is a little sidestep, but have you read the book Hidden Valley Road? It's
I actually haven't.
Okay. I just started to read it, and it's about schizophrenia, and it's about a family who had 12 children, 6 of which were diagnosed with schizophrenia. But the part of the book that I'm in right now, and I couldn't help but sort of relate it to what parents deal with when they have larger children, is this whole culture back in I think it was the 40s and 50s, that really viewed schizophrenia as a mothering problem. And that if you were a family with a child who had schizophrenia, the immediate blame went to the mother as the cause of that. Some breakdown in the relationship early on, controlling mothers. And it just made me, when I was reading it, I was like, this is, in a lot of ways, this is what happens with parents in today's society. They see, our society looks at larger children and immediately in the brain blame the parents or blame food, or some shortcoming on the parenting spectrum is the reason for this. And I think that part of this conversation, the goal of part of this conversation and all conversations I have on this topic, is to make it clear to parents that, it's kind of like eating disorders. There's the genetic component, and then there's the environmental component that helps express the genetic component, right? We always used to say, with eating disorders, if you have the genetic predisposition, the gun's loaded. It's the environment that pulls the trigger. Not to have like a gun conversation, but it's just sort of the way to frame it. And it's the same that I think it's the same that we're seeing with obesity. That this genetic predisposition is not destination. It's not destiny, rather, but because there's this environment that you can completely, really get a handle on and optimize in lots of different ways to help a child. But there is, I guess I'm kind of circling around here, but I think that one of the things that is important for parents who are listening is that, I understand it's not a parental sort of in a vacuum responsibility fault.
Right. And even if there were things you feel like you could have done better, you can't go back, right? I always say this to parents, like, how is it serving you to sit around feeling guilty about things you should have done 2 years ago? You can't change it. You're here now. You want to make a change now. That's great, right? Like, feeling sorry that you didn't do something before isn't changing anything. It's just making you feel worse.
Yeah.
But I think there, taking it away from fault and more towards promotion and positivity, right? There's a very easy way for parents to role model more of this wellness lifestyle versus the dieting culture. Think about how many women who are mothers who are on a diet.
Yeah.
Right. So, or who, I see this all the time. With my own teenage daughter, I'll catch myself making a comment that's negative about myself, and she's hearing every one of those comments. Like if I say, don't post that picture because I have a double chin in it, or I look fat in these jeans, my daughter hears every time I say that. And so I see a lot of kids in my private practice for therapy who tend to have maybe like a very diet conscious, body conscious, thin mother, and the child is not thin, and they see their mother constantly calling themselves fat, and yet this child is bigger than their mother.
Yes.
So how is that what does that make them feel? Like, well, my mom thinks she's fat and she's smaller than me, so what does my mom think about me?
Yes.
Right. And so it's this role modeling culture that's really important.
Yeah. I used to see that a lot too. Or the mothers who would eat a salad for dinner and feed their children at a separate table chicken nuggets and mac and cheese or kid food, pasta. But not eat with the children and have a completely different, taking care of their own health, but not sort of taking care of, the food balance for their children for whatever reason. And so I think that there is, there's something there, and we should probably unpack that a little bit, is, what's going on with mothers. And actually, I don't want to just say it's mothers, because I've seen fathers who are who are super,
parents, parents.
who are also super health conscious and restrictive with their eating, and could probably classify as disordered eaters as well, and who are hyper vigilant and concerned about their larger children. So, what's going on with parents? Like, let's unpack that a little bit. How are the pressures of today's world affecting parents of children who are larger?
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's affecting all of us because, and I'll tell you, this could be a whole nother episode, Joe, but it's about social media and it's about the constant photographing that's happening, right? We're seeing ourselves way more than we did growing up. We grew up, you got your pictures back a week later and then you tore them up if you didn't like them and no one ever saw them, right? This generation of children and parents, right, are posting, they're filtering, they are, doing all these different, taking pictures of each other without them even knowing. Kids take pictures of each other on Snapchat and don't even tell, and then send it to all their friends. Like, it's horrible, right? So I think that is a big piece of it in this day and age, just the whole culture of body image and constantly being photographed and constantly looking at yourself. And we all know pictures don't tell a whole story and can be really upsetting.
Yeah.
But aside from that, I do think I think there's this idea that like parents should be educated enough now to know the right things to do to help their children. Like, right, there's the internet, there's Google, like you should know better. And most of the parents that I see, really do feel like they're feeding their child healthy. And it's not that they're not, it's just that they just need to tweak a few things or they need to change a few pieces here and there or make some smaller changes. But there's this idea that you're supposed to know and you're supposed to get it. And like, why don't you just have your kids on paleo, or why aren't your kids doing keto or whatever, right? Like these things we definitely don't want kids doing because they're growing and they need the nourishment that they'd be lacking with that. But parents are getting their information online.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if I fully answered that question, but there's just so many areas, so many avenues to go with this topic.
Yeah, there are. And it is a big topic. And, we have learned a lot about social media. And I guess when you said we're taking pictures a lot, and I thought of myself as a child, and we never had a mirror or a scale in my house growing up in the 70s and the early 80s. Like, I never looked at my whole body when I was, we just didn't do that. Of course, I didn't have a mother that was, super concerned with any of that. So I know that others did have, experiences where they were weighed but from my personal experience, I didn't have that. And I look at kids today, I have four kids. And, they are of that culture of taking photos, selfies. I mean, they're the selfie
constant
culture.
And it's constant. That's how they text. It's like all day in the phone. Yeah. Yeah. And so you can imagine now these kids are looking at other kids and thinking like they're looking at these filtered role models, right? Like the celebrity. And we've always had that. We had the supermodels and the pinup girls, right? They have this new generation of online influencers, right, who are promoting, and the sad part is that they're promoting, they're getting paid to promote diets that are toxic or that are scary, like, the supplements or the teas or the things like the juice cleanses, right? The things we definitely don't want our kids pursuing. But they see, the Kardashians holding up this, item that they were paid $1 million to promote. And now they're like, oh, well, if I do that, I'll look like that. Right. Yeah. So there's still this advertising, marketing, online culture, there's so many facets that our kids have to deal with that we didn't even have. Right.
And I feel like parents are probably want to take some control of that, but like, where do they even begin to sort of pull in the reins a little bit on social media?
Right. So educating and listening and communicate, asking questions, constantly ask your kids questions. Like, don't pretend to know what they see and what they experience. Just say like, what is that? What do you think about that? Like, do you think that a tea really makes you lose weight? Like what makes you think you want to lose weight? Maybe you don't even need to lose weight. Right. I mean, I think it's just a good idea to have conversations about it, but not your opinion. Just ask your kids questions and let them tell you their opinion about it. Which brings up another good point that I wanted to make earlier, and that is not all kids actually need to lose weight. Right?
I was just going to say that. I was just going to say, can we talk about acceptance?
Because and we keep talking lose weight, and that's it's so funny because I don't use the word weight in my programs, I always say, don't talk about pounds, don't talk about weight, don't talk about dieting.
Yeah.
So I try really hard not to do that.
I tried not to do that too. And I find myself gravitating to larger child, bigger child.
Some kids, if they're still growing, right, they don't actually need to lose weight. They just need to maintain their weight while they continue to grow. And then eventually their BMI will stabilize, or they'll be a healthier weight for their height.
Right.
So I think having this pressure on lose weight, it's really might just be about, how about we just stop gaining at the rate that we're gaining at for a year or for 2 years or for a month, right? Because it's just, if we slow down the gain, that will make an improvement.
Sure. For sure. And then, what do you think about how we talk about children who carry extra weight, the terminology and the words that we use? I mean, I think that there's a lot of, there's a movement out there to embrace the word fat. There's a movement out there to get away from the words weight, overweight, obesity. What are your thoughts around that?
Right. So I think it's important for parents to remember, because every parent that would come see me at the clinic would be so upset that obesity was listed on the medical record. Obesity is like these other big fancy words you see on your medical record that you don't need to worry about. It's for health insurance. It's for billing. It has nothing to do with who you are, what a child is like, what their personality. It's a medical term. It's like any other medical. If you have an allergy to a medication, it's on your chart. It's the same thing, right? So I think it's important to try to get away from that, like that word means something. It's medical. It's healthcare jargon, right?
Yeah.
I think that's one piece. The other piece, though, is I don't agree that just using the word fat openly is a great idea. I think it's still a shaming word. I think it's like ugly or stupid. And I think when kids hear it, they feel badly about themselves.
Yeah.
That said, I do try to take the focus off the words weight, pounds, and dieting, and do try to put it more on fitness, strong, energize, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a child that's 20 pounds overweight, but your child plays 3 sports, moves their body every day, eats fruits and vegetables every day, doesn't overconsume sugar, does well in school, gets a good amount of sleep, you have a really high functioning child. Your child's fine. I'm not worried about your child. So it's like less about what they look like or what the weight is, and more about what the behaviors are.
And they're functioning in their day-to-day lives.
That's right.
Yeah. So let's talk. That sort of leads me into this conversation about acceptance, and not only sort of accept. I'm really thinking about parents accepting the child that they have and the body that child has. What's your advice or thoughts around that?
That's hard.
I find it is hard. It is hard because I just want to back that up with, I see the struggle that parents have for accepting that they want to change potentially a child that is never going to be a thin child. That child can be a fit child, that child can be a healthy child, but they may not fit into a shape or size that is acceptable to the parent. And so I want to sort of explore that a little bit and get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. And I think that has to do with the parent's own perception of weight and what that means to them.
Yeah.
Right. I've had a lot of kids come into the weight clinic and feel like they're fine. Like they're like, I like myself. I think I look great. And I've had parents kind of talk to me privately with the child not in the room and say, like, how can she wear a bikini? Like, isn't she embarrassed of herself? Like, I got quiet as I was saying that, because that's how they say, like, how can she wear a crop top? Like, I would never wear that if I looked like that. Like, that's a you issue, mom, right? That's like, you should be really excited and happy that your child loves themselves that much and is that confident, because I'll tell you, there's a lot of thin girls that wouldn't wear that. And we'd be like, why not? So that comes from a lot of our own biases from cultural biases about, how you should look and what you should wear. I mean, I think particularly for women, right, and girls. And I think that that's, a fascinating cultural piece of this, is that, like, some parents I see are literally disgusted by their child, like, right. But it's because they feel like it's something they would never want for themselves when their child may actually be fine.
Yeah. Yeah. So how does a parent sort of overcome these biases? How do they, like I said, accept their child for who they are on the inside rather than the exterior appearance?
And I think you just got to strip it down to, what do you want for your child? You want your child to be happy and healthy. And, really, at the end of the day, what more do you want?
Yeah.
right? Like successful, maybe, right? You want your child to have a great life and feel good about themselves and feel happy. Like and be healthy. These are your goals as a parent. It's not you want your child to be a supermodel or you want your child to be, there's these other aspects that really, when you break it down, aren't that important. And so I think it's for parents helpful to just go back to like, what's truly important to you at the end of the day for your child.
Yeah.
And how much of that is about you? Like, again, I see a lot of these parents that grew up being, with weight stigma or being shamed by their parents. And they're like, I just don't want to do that to my child. And then I'll see their children saying like, my mom doesn't care what I eat because I'm allowed to do whatever I want. And she's taken me to, ice cream after this as a reward for coming to this appointment today. And it's like, whoa, right? Like, let's not do that. But it happens, right? Because it's like this fear. And it all comes back to our own sense of parents of things that happen to us and trying to either do the opposite, right? Like how many times have you said, I'm not going to be like my mother, right? Or I'm not going to be like my father in this way. But then, that can be really challenging if you take it too much to the other side.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that really resonates with me because, raising my own, I have 3 daughters and then my youngest is a boy, and the pressures on them and how they operate in the world, social media, their friends, what they choose to do, just how they appear, all of that is, I have really tried hard. And I'm sure as a healthcare professional, you probably do the same with your daughter, but to really keep food very neutral, keep, being that role model, trying to do it all right. But at the end of the day, you can go into doing all of this right and still have kids that have to figure it out on their own, have to sort of navigate who they are and who they want to be and what their goals are. At some point, the goal is to raise these autonomous kids, autonomous with eating, autonomous with decision making, launching and, full-fledged functioning healthy adults. And at some point, you have to sort of take the hands off the wheel when they are getting older and say, you got to figure some of this stuff out. And I find that was true for me, that I did my best to set up the environment, but at some point you have to let them, be the adults they're going to be, take responsibility for what they're going to take responsibility for.
Yeah, for sure. The best quote I ever heard from Marianne Lewis, a nurse practitioner at Children's Still in the OWL program. She's been there a really long time. She always says to parents, your job is not necessarily to make everything better, but your job is to not make it worse.
Yeah.
Right. So yes, you don't necessarily have to, put your child on this program and get your child all the resources they need and do all of these things for them. Because quite frankly, if you do too much, right, if you put too much pressure on your child, especially teenagers, as you and I know, they're just going to do the opposite of what you say, or do nothing. Like I always have these teenagers that are like, I was going to clean my room and then my mom told me to, and now I'm not going to.
Yes.
Like, what is that? I hear this I was just about to write my paper and my mom said, did you write your paper? And now I'm not writing it. Like, okay. So same thing, right? With eating, it's like, I wasn't planning to have that brownie, but as soon as my mom said, don't eat that brownie, now I'm going to have 5. Right.
Yeah.
So I do think there's this way that we can be careful about not putting too much pressure on our kids because we're going to get the reverse result. But we don't have to make it worse. So here's examples of how you might make it worse. Like if I know my child really struggles with sweets, I don't have to bake cookies every day and leave them out on the counter and then get mad at them for not, for taking them when they weren't for them.
Right.
Right. I hear parents say like, oh, I can't buy chips because they disappear. Well, then don't buy chips. Like who needs them? Right. Yeah. Have them at a party, have them during the Super Bowl. That's fine. But you don't need to have them in your house every day if you're only going to shame your child for taking them. Right. So, or, my child gets Starbucks every day after school or Dunkin' Donuts. And it's like, okay, where are they getting the money from? Like, right. It's right. There's these ways that we kind of enable things being a little bit worse. Yeah. And we can just try to avoid doing that rather than having to constantly fix it.
Yeah. So I'm curious how you would respond to healthcare professionals out there who are concerned about restriction of food for children who are larger or heavier. Because one of the things that there's this whole messaging around let's fix the weight versus let's do intuitive eating. And so I'm getting emails from parents who are, saying to me, they want to do the intuitive eating thing. They're working with somebody on intuitive eating, but they're being advised to leave the cookies out all day long, to have candy in the house, to let the child have as much whenever they want to have it. And I'm hearing from parents that they're very uncomfortable with this. They're trying it, but it's not really in the end making a difference from a standpoint of eating behaviors, from a standpoint of healthy relationship with food. What are you seeing in that area? What are your thoughts on that?
I feel like there's a dangerous path there of just unlimited, figure out your own sense of fullness and you'll eventually know what's comfortable for you. I don't think kids can do that on their own. I see a lot of adults that can't do that, right? It takes years of getting into intuitive eating can take months and years for an adult to start changing their own relationship with food. So it's really hard for a child. And there are a lot of components of intuitive eating that are great and fantastic. And I think that they are very valuable, especially the anti-diet culture aspect of it. But I do think that kids need some limits. Like kids need limits about everything, right? Like it's not like you're going to say, yeah, go run out in the street, or if you like the way those chewable Tylenol take, like have at it, right? Like there's all these limits we set for our children anyway about what they put in their bodies, where they go, what they do. So like I think it's okay to have some limits around food. In fact, I think it's necessary, especially for younger kids. So I would see kids, and maybe some of our listeners are experiencing this, 6-year-old, 4-year-old who would get on a chair and sneak food, right? How do you know your 6-year-old, 4-year-old isn't getting on a chair and eating something they shouldn't be eating? Like not because it's unhealthy, but because it's like dangerous, right? Or like it's, not something that maybe it's expired, maybe it's poison. I don't know. I just feel like there's all these limits we set anyway about food and what we put in our bodies. So I think it's okay. Yeah. I just think there's a way you do it, right? So for example, you just casually stop bringing in as much. I'm not saying don't ever have candy. Like if Christmas Day and you're having cookies, right? Go ahead. But it's like, why do you need to have cookies in the house every day? How is that benefiting? How are cookies benefiting your child to get them through their day? Yeah. Right. And I think it's looking at it more like that. Like, how is this serving you? How is this energizing you? Yeah. And if it's just for fun or if because it tastes good, I'm all for it. Enjoy that. But we don't need to do that every day. Yeah. Yeah. Because if you eat too much sugar every day, you're probably not going to feel so great. It's just that. It's like, that's the way I talk to kids. You're probably not going to feel so great. I don't say you're going to get heavy, you're going to gain weight, you're not going to lose weight. You're not going to feel so great. If you start your day, with high sugar cereal and an orange juice and you're starting your day with 200 grams of sugar in your body. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with that, but you're not going to feel so great. By the time you get to your second class of the day, you're probably going to be sleepy and hungry again. Like, we can talk to our kids like that. And that's really normal. And you could tell that to a kid of any size. Yeah.
I think what's also important to point out is that this is so layered and individualized and nuanced, because there are parents out there that are going to say, and they've said it to me, my child is highly triggered by sweets and treats. If they see them, they're quote unquote obsessed with them. And that is true. There are some children that are highly triggered by those foods. And then parents are also hearing, don't restrict those foods because it drives children to want those foods more. And so there's a lot of, I want to just say for the listeners out there, there's a lot of nuance here. Everybody's got a different situation. But I think what you're saying is overall, just, children thrive on structure, predictability, routines, limits, sort of those guardrails that you set up as parents to keep your kids safe. And it is, I believe it is okay to set up guardrails around food. I feel that that's your job as a parent, to be able to set that structure in your home, have those guardrails up. It is okay to say no to food at certain times. I feel like sometimes from a parenting standpoint, we have lost our power in that area. It's okay to tell your teenager they can't go out at midnight to go see their friends. I mean, saying no is part of parenting. And that sort of, no, you can't stay up late tonight. You have a test tomorrow. No, you can't we're not having dessert tonight. We have dessert on Wednesdays, or, we're just not doing that tonight. It's okay to say no. And I think that, when we think about raising healthy kids, I think it's important to think about raising them healthy, wellness, pro-lifestyle, with those avenues to get to the end point where that child knows how to take care of their body, and they know how to make decisions that help them function well in the world, no matter what size they are.
Right. And I think it's about how you say no, right? Like, yes, we have to say no, but we don't have to be mean. I mean, we don't have to say like, no, you can't have seconds. You've had enough. Like, how could you possibly be hungry, right? Everyone says, how could you possibly be hungry? You just ate. How about changing your language? Like, I understand you're feeling still hungry. I know that that's challenging because you want more, but your body's had enough for this meal. And guess what? We're going to eat again in 3 hours, right? Like, because I think kids feel this scarcity issue, like this. They get scared, they're not going to eat again. Like, or that and that's the point with restricting too. I don't believe in restricting any one food entirely, right? I don't believe in you can never have ice. You tell a kid they can never have ice cream, guess they're only going to want ice cream. But I do believe you don't have to have 3 gallons of ice cream in your freezer to have an argument about every time you want to say no, but you don't know how, and it's right there in front of them, right? How about you go on a Friday night and get an ice cream cone as a family, and that's your Friday night family routine, so they know it's coming and it doesn't feel scarce. Right. And I think there's a way you can say, like you said, we're not having dessert tonight, or we're having fruit for dessert tonight, and that's our dessert. And you establish those boundaries, and they can choose whether to have it or not. But it's you set up the structure. And they can tell you, you're the meanest mom. We have no food in this house. Like, when I go to so-and-so's house, they have Cheetos and all this. And it's like, great, good for them. Right. Like, it's okay for you to have your own boundaries in your own home. And it's going to, and as you know, having 4, like, this is going to come up with everything about saying no. Like, parents always say, I can't say no. I don't know how to do it. And I say, what do you do when you're at Target and you're in like that aisle with all the little toys and your child wants 5 toys? Do you say yes to all of them? And they're like, no, of course not. That'd be crazy. Okay. Well, like, you can say no about some things then, right?
So what is it about food?
It's because it's this idea that you're going to cause an eating disorder. I think that's really what it is. And that's why I think you need to be careful about how you phrase it, but you still can say no. Like, in fact, you need to set up those boundaries. But I think it's not about saying like, no, you can't have that unless you lose some weight, or like, or right, your sibling can have it. Like, these other ways that we can make it more shaming. Maybe if you exercise more, you could eat like that. Like, all these comments. Unnecessary. Just like, no, we're not having that today. No, we're not doing that right now. No, you've had enough. If you're still hungry, you can have this, fruit or whatever other option, right? I think there's a way we can set it up that's acknowledging you're feeling a certain way, acknowledging you want things, but that's not what we're doing. And making sure that that's not what we're all doing. Like, the worst thing you could do is serve something to everyone else and then say to this kid, well, you can't do that. Then you're shaming, right?
So for my last question, it's really just in case this question is for parents out there who might be listening and wondering if their child is experiencing any of those psychological effects we talked about earlier. And are there signs that parents should be looking for? And if they're seeing those signs, what can they do about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what can be helpful is just, again, checking in, asking if your child's getting teased at school at all, like, what are kids saying? Usually some kids are pretty good about telling a parent, oh, so-and-so called me fat, or sometimes kids will say like, I don't like my belly, or kids will make comments typically if they're uncomfortable with themselves. But if you're not sure, I think you could check in. Again, if your kid is thriving and they have friends and they're happy, it might not be something that they're struggling with. It might just be more something you're struggling with, or that the doctor is saying you should address. I think, keeping your eye out for warning signs of isolation or depression, if they're talking negatively about themselves, if they're constantly saying, and not even just weight, I'm stupid, I'm ugly, no one likes me. I mean, the reality is with kids these days, if it's not weight, it's going to be something else. It's going to be acne. It's going to be skin color. It's going to be height. It's going to be your clothes. It's going to be something. Money. right? It's like, no matter what, their kids will find a way to tease each other and feel badly about themselves. So just constantly check in, just say, how was school today? What are people saying? What are people doing? I think, and reminding your kids the positive things about themselves all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Building that up. I think parents have so much power to protect their children and to put their children on a healthy path. And I always say, what we learn about nutrition for our kids is so important for ourselves too. We can learn so much about ourselves as adults as we sort of go on this journey with our children. I really appreciate everything that you've said today. It's really been a very enlightening conversation, and I hope very helpful for the listeners out there. How can parents get in touch, find you, find your work?
Sure. Yeah. So my website is pastparentfuture, all one word.com. And I do workshops for parents about these kinds of issues, right? How you can make just small, easy, micro changes in your family approach to improve eating and maybe result in weight loss. It's not like a diet program, right? Because again, that's against what we want. It's more just like, okay, how do I get my kid to snack less? Like, how do I get my kid to move more? All my kid wants to do is play video games or be on social media. Well, how do I get them out? Right? Easy, tiny little things that most parents struggle with. So that's the focus on that. And my Instagram is @pastparentfuture and on Facebook as well. So that's the best way to reach me.
That's awesome.
The other piece I wanted to mention is I just published that book, 3+3 Stars for Me. That's for school age kids, so probably up until about 6th grade. But that is it's the simplest little journal. It's really just every day your child writes 3 things that they are proud of or liked about themselves. There's some prompts. And then the same day, the parent has to write 3 things that they appreciate about the child every day. And you'd be surprised, like, how many parents struggle with that. Like, are we actually praising or complimenting or noticing good things in our child 3 things a day and saying them out loud? Or are we still like, nagging, like, well, you didn't clean your room, you didn't do your homework, you didn't brush your teeth, like constant. And we're never saying, I noticed you brushed your teeth without me asking. That was great. So that book is available on Amazon right now and also on my website.
I'll include that link in the show notes. I appreciate that. And it sounds like such a powerful exercise for parents and children to do together.
Yeah, and it's really giving them that few minutes of time together every day without phones, which is good.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Fishman. I appreciate you having you on the show today.
Yeah, me too. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child Podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.